I wanted to begin with the bracha for studying Torah. Kaplan had a very expansive view of what Torah was, and in a sense he thought Torah was anything you studied that improved your life. He was sort of famous for one of his habits, which was he put on tefillin every day. You know, everyone knows what tefillin are, Tallit and tefillin, and daven 3 times a day. But his idea of davening was a little unusual. Some days he would put on his Tallit and tefillin and read John Dewey, which was a philosopher he approached about. He'd spend 15 minutes reading John Dewey with his Tallit and tefillin on, and then he'd close the book and take off his Tallit and tefillin, and that was his morning shacharit prayer. So in that spirit, we are learning Torah tonight, and we should start with the bracha. So, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. The scope of this course is to talk about basic Reconstructionist thought up until the early 1970s, and mostly focusing on Rabbi Kaplan and on his immediate disciples. And the reason for this, reason we sort of cut it off at 1970, was Reconstructionism itself is an evolving movement, has continued to evolve since the 70s. Up till 1970, Kaplan was sort of the acknowledged leader. He lived till 1983, but he was getting quite old by 1970. He was the acknowledged leader, and what he said went. So there was one Reconstructionism pretty much, not exactly, but pretty much until about 1970. And after that, it started to, you know, like any movement, evolve and splinter and go off into different directions. So it's hard to say what Reconstructionism is today. We can argue what we want it to be, but it is many things today. Almost everything I say tonight will be repeated in some form or another in the other classes, where we'll have more time to go into detail and discussion. So this is intended to give you a broad, sweeping overview of the whole thing. The next class in a week from tonight is Emunat Yisrael, the faith of Israel, and it will focus on God, values, and sort of the influences on Kaplan thinking. The next session after that, which will be, again, myself, will be on Am Yisrael, or peoplehood, a central idea of Kaplan. And we'll talk about nationalism, his idea of ethical nationalism, the meaning of Jewish peoplehood, diaspora versus Israel, and his idea of Zionism. The final class will be led by Mitch, Torat Yisrael, or Judaism, the formal public religion of the Jewish people. We'll be talking about the evolution of that, the function of religion, and rituals and evolving rituals. So again, this course is going to focus on Kaplan. And Kaplan is central to Reconstructionism, perhaps more than any other leader is central to a stream of Judaism. It's really his invention. And one of the reasons he's central is that he lived for a very long time. He lived for 102 years. He was born in 1881, died in 1983, and he was productive for pretty much all that period. He wrote his last book in 1970. He published his last book. He was well over 80 years old. The other reason is he taught. For most of that time, he taught at the JTS for over 50 years. He was a teacher at the Jewish Theological Seminary. He trained many generations of conservative rabbis. And I don't know how many of you went to conservative synagogues as youth, but without a doubt, your rabbi was trained by Mordeccai Kaplan, among others. His most perhaps famous disciples, he was his son-in-law Ira Eisenstein, who eventually led the split from the conservative movement and founded the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. Arthur Hertzberg, a very famous public figure and rabbi, head of the American Jewish Congress for many years, author of the Zionist Idea, a public intellectual. Rabbi Schulweis, the famous author. Harold Kushner, the author of When Good People, Bad Things Happen to Good People, and many other books. So a lot of his disciples who were never formally Reconstructionists simply because they were too old. They graduated and went into the professional life before the Reconstructionist movement formally broke from the conservative movement, were essentially Reconstructionists. They were trained by him and bought into his worldview. So he had a lot of influence. He wrote 11 major books. He edited the Reconstructionist magazine for 30 years. He was the editor and wrote dozens, perhaps hundreds of articles and pamphlets. So he was a very influential figure. Kaplan is central, but he's not the last word. And he would have admitted this as well. Kaplan believed Judaism evolves. So while this course is going to be teaching you what Kaplan thought, we certainly have the right to disagree with him. I don't agree with everything I'm going to be telling you that he believed in. And he would have approved of that, I thought. And I wanted to actually read this little quote from the introduction to the 1994 edition of Judaism as a Civilization. Arthur Hertzberg relates that Kaplan would regularly tear apart the sermons students gave in his homiletics class, a habit that one day prompted Hertzberg to repeat in his sermon, word for word, remarks that Kaplan had made the week before. Kaplan immediately stood up and tore the sermon apart. "But Dr. Kaplan," Hertzberg protested, "I'm only saying what you said last week." But Arthur, came the reply. "I have learned something since then." And we have learned something since Kaplan passed away, so we certainly have the right to criticize him. If he could criticize his own thoughts of a week before, we can certainly do that. So, again, a couple of words about Kaplan's personality, which influences the movement, influences his writing. A lot of people find Kaplan dry and unemotional, and they don't like that. A lot of it's a function of his personality, not of his ideas. First of all, he was Lithuanian. He came from the Lithuanian tradition, Northern European anti-Hasidic tradition. His father was a rabbi in Lithuania. He himself was born in Lithuania. And just the cultural milieu was there with you don't cry, you don't laugh in public. You know, you're a proper person, and the Hasidim are all nuts for, you know, being too emotional. He very much believed in modern in the sense of the early 20th century of the word modern. Science was a good thing, unreservedly. Rational thought was a good thing, unreservedly. If we think and plan and organize ourselves, we can improve human life. There's no question about that. Today, we doubt that. We're postmodern. But he was a modern person. So he believed that, you know, if you thought something through and you analyzed it, you could come to very valid conclusions. So he's definitely not a new agey type of person. He was rational coming out of that. He believed in the power of analysis. He always tried to be clear and consistent. He's not a very good writer, actually. He writes like a lawyer or engineer. He writes ponderously in order to be clear, which sometimes is unclear because the sentences get to be very long, but that's what he's trying to do. And emotionally, he's not a person who loves mystery. So a lot of people crave, you know, mystics crave mystery. They want things to be unclear, and that sort of turns them on, that fuzziness and unclearness. He didn't like that. He wanted things to be clear, and he thought that they could be clear. I view these as personality things and matters of taste myself, and not ideological things. But that sort of mood informs his writing. And I put a little thing. He admits that there are things that are unknowable or ineffable, meaning mysterious or mystical. But he's not interested in writing about them because he says they're ineffable. You can't talk about them. Yes, they exist, but what's the point of talking about them? You can't say anything useful about them other than that they exist. So he admits they exist, and he goes on, you know, to talk about the things you can talk about. Why does he feel he has to do something new and different? When I was taught about Kaplan a couple of times, a couple of lectures that I've been to, it's usually framed in the case, well, you know, he was a son of immigrants. He was talking to the children and grandchildren of immigrants who were lost in America, you know, who the old world didn't work for them, the old ways didn't work, they wanted to assimilate, but they were conflicted. You know, that's the mood, you know, and that's all true. But to say that puts him firmly in the 1920s and 30s and seems to cut him off from today. And I don't think that that's true. I think if you actually read what he wrote, again, I'm going to read some quotes here, you'll see that the problems he's talking about are problems we face today. It's true that those people felt them more acutely than we do, but they're the same problems we feel today. I think we don't feel them today because so many Jews today are so assimilated they don't even care about this anymore. But they're really the same problems. So this is the opening lines of Judaism as a Civilization. These are the very first words of his magnus opus and sort of first major book. Judaism is a problem to those who have to teach it. And what Jew is exempt from teaching it? Nowadays, anyone who displays an interest in Jewish activities is challenged and must be prepared to explain what positive he sees in Judaism. He must be prepared to communicate his ideas in articulate form if he does not want to be suspect of yielding to blind habit or sentiment. The problem, of course, is not with Judaism as a quotation of what our forebears believed and felt, which the bearers of the future are expected to accept and live by. Formerly, the mere knowledge of the past carried with it a categorical imperative for the future. Now, anything that claims a place in the future must be justified by all that the future represents at its best. I think those words are as true today as they were when he wrote them in the early 30s. When I have to explain to my children why they should be Jewish, the same thing. I can't say, oh, your grandparents did this, I did it when I was little. It doesn't cut water with them. You have to explain what it holds for the future, and you have to tie it with what the future represents at its best. It has to be tied to something positive about the future, however we understand that, and we might disagree on what we think the best is in the future. And if you can't tie Judaism to that it will make your life better, it will make the world better, people will just say, why bother? And that's what he's saying in that paragraph. And that's the challenge of Judaism. It was in the 30s and it is today. Some other quotes, which I think are just timely today as when he wrote them in the 30s. The average Jew today is conscious of his Judaism as one is conscious of a diseased organ. It gives notice of its existence by causing pain. If we take any Jewish newspaper and eliminate it from its contents, references to and discussions of anti-Semitism and the like, we will find little left. So I challenge you to go to the Canadian Jewish News, tear out all the parts about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and you'll be left with the ads. That's what, that's what he's saying. The Jew is maladjusted morally and spiritually as a result of losing the traditional concept of salvation. He has to evolve a new purpose in life as a Jew. That purpose will constitute his salvation. It is only then that he will gladly identify himself with Jewish life. Again, he uses the word salvation, which I think rubs a lot of people the wrong way. It sounds very Christian. He didn't seem to mind it. But he means fulfillment, meaning, purpose in your life. If Judaism doesn't give you fulfillment or purpose, what's the point? And it says it has stopped giving people purpose in the 30s. Most Jews don't see a purpose. It's just a nostalgic attachment, and they don't see the purpose. And again, it is by no means a foregone conclusion that Judaism in America is destined to live. It all depends on what the Jews of this and the next generation will do. So again, he's worried about the future of Judaism in America, and I think we have right to be worried about it today as well. So none of this, to me, has changed. So again, his analysis of what the problem is, Judaism is thought of as a religion by most people, and most people don't take religion seriously in the 20s and 30s. It's a very modern age. Religion in general, Christianity as well, is not thought of well. People are modern into science, people are abandoning religion, and Judaism has been defined as a religion, and therefore we've hung our hat on a losing proposition. There is no concept of secular Judaism outside of Zionism. So again, Zionism was not that popular in the 20s and 30s, and even maybe got popular in the 40s in the light of the Holocaust. But until the State of Israel was declared, it was a minority taste among American Jews, and maybe even afterwards. So there's no concept of secular Judaism, except for the Zionists, who are these weird people over on the side, the secular Zionists. Judaism in America is very factionalized in his day. There is no concept of the federation. That doesn't exist in the 30s. America allows for assimilation and even demands assimilation. The public culture in America is we're all Americans. Stop being ethnic. Stop being, this is again before multiculturalism, before, that sort of changed in the 60s under the pressure of the black civil rights movement, when you could be proud to be black, so suddenly you could be proud to be anything. But that wasn't the case in the 20s and 30s. American Jews don't know how to reconcile liberal modernism with Judaism. And so I wanted to show you a video here. So these are two Muslims today discussing the problem of Muslims in America. And it strikes me that their problem in America is very much like the Jews' problem in the 20s and 30s.
I can't believe I'm saying this as a man of religion. I think we overemphasize the role of religion. And I think we pretty much limit ourselves unwisely so to the religion conversation all the time. I think the Jewish community's experience, I don't know, what do you think, in terms of how they were able to come to terms with their own diversity within themselves. It could be a source of inspiration because it's very similar, where they were able to, outside of synagogue, outside of their denominational affiliation, they were able to create these local, national, and even international civic, non-profit Jewish organizations, where in the boards of these organizations, a shrimp-eating Jew and the strictly Shabbat-observing Jew can sit together for a common cause and basically with an organized, unified voice, talk about who they are and what they want and what are the pressing issues in the Jewish community. And then they go back to their respective faith communities or worship houses and stick with what kind of theology that they would like to stick with.
Right. And I think we as Muslims generally can learn a lot from the Jewish community in the US and how it has been able to negotiate all those differences and yet remain unified. But I think one of the reasons that possibly that the Jewish community has been able to do this is that it has allowed itself to fall along those denominational lines, because I often say if I were Jewish I would be Reconstructionist, because that's where I would be along kind of the spectrum of things, and I gain a lot of inspiration from how the Reconstructionist sect of Judaism came about, because I know that the man who founded it, whose name I cannot remember right now, but he was the son of immigrants in the United States during the last century, and he basically said, look, we are no longer Jews in Poland or Russia or anywhere else. We are now Jewish in America. And what does it mean to be Jewish in America? And that was one of kind of his inspirations for Reconstructionism. And I also identify a lot with the reformist trend in Judaism, because I identify generally as more liberally and more as a more secular Muslim. But I find a lot of resistance to this idea among the Muslim community, because I think a lot of Muslims worry that this will just kind of divide us. But I think, if anything, it will allow everybody to openly identify with something that they're more comfortable with, without having to constantly kind of keel to the conservative equals authentic, and still remain Muslim. And then perhaps once everybody recognizes that their comfort with religion is recognized, then maybe we can all come together. Because when I see, those national groups, that we've mentioned, like the Islamic Society of North America, like the Council on American Islamic Relations, like so many others, I honestly see, like, as you said many times, the most conservative voices on their boards representing views that I do not identify with at all. And I cannot imagine that they would have a national conference where they would, it's been very difficult to even persuade them to have slightly more liberal voices at their national conferences. So, for someone like me, I think, why bother? Why would I even want to go to their conferences if they're not going to have space for me? So I think until we start recognizing all those spaces that we create for ourselves, it will be hard to come together as a community.
Jews have that Muslims don't have, a community organization, pluralism, are things that didn't exist in America in the 20s and 30s. To a large part, I don't overemphasize it, but to a large part, it was Kaplan himself and his advocacy of things like Jewish community centers, of federation, of religious pluralism, that created the American Jewish community we have today. There are secular Muslims who want to be Muslim, but they're not religious. The same issues that Jews faced in the 30s, and we face today. There are secular Jews who want to be Jewish and don't know how to be Jewish. It's divided factionally. You have to choose between a synagogue. A synagogue is the only way to be Jewish. There's no other way to be Jewish. These are issues that he was trying to address. So all these things that I've thrown up on the screen here are ideas that are floating around and influencing him. So you have to remember, his formative years intellectually were around the turn of the century. So the whole idea of evolution, God clearly didn't create people, so it undermines the entire traditional religious view. Marxism, very popular. A lot of his writing is in opposition to Marxism, or in reaction to Marxism, if not in opposition to it. A lot of Jews are drawn to the millennialism of Marxism. They've taken their messianic fervor and pushed it in that direction. Zionism is coming up. He was 15 or something when the first Zionist Congress happened. He's a very early Zionist. He's a Zionist, like in 1900-something. He already identifies as a Zionist. But again, it's a minority trend in the Jewish community. In America, there's what's called the progressive movement. Theodore Roosevelt, there's the whole idea of progressive social legislation. Theodore Roosevelt was the first American president to try to pass health care in 1905 or something like that. So it's something, again, he gets swept up in this idea of, so progressive social legislation can change things. Sociology. Sociology is essentially born in the 1890s. Psychology, pre-Freud, the pre-Freudian psychology, again, just growing up around the turn of the century. Anthropology. He's very influenced by anthropology, by comparative religion, by discoveries that other religions have myths and legends very similar to the Jewish myths and legends. And he's faced with it and says, well, so our ideas aren't unique. These just pop up everywhere. So what does that mean about our ideas? These are the things that are challenging him. His sort of seminal years, the years where he's writing most of his books, the 20s, 30s, and 40s, he's faced with the rise of fascism. He's very concerned with the world is going to hell in a handbasket. He's very worried about that. He's worried about assimilation, which is really starting to take hold again in the 20s and 30s. The pre-World War I people are still holding on because they still have that memory of their immigrant parents are still alive. Their immigrant parents start to die off. The next generation starts to assimilate. The looming Second World War, the Depression. He's very left-wing in a lot of his writings, influenced by the Depression. Jews and everybody are poor. There's lots of poor people and hungry people in America. And then his sort of reflective years, we have the state of Israel, which he writes about, again, continuing the threat of assimilation and the threat of nuclear war. He was very concerned with the threat of nuclear war in the 50s and 60s. So these are the sort of the ideas that are going on and influencing him, and sort of shaking up his traditional Jewish roots. He was born into an Orthodox household. His father was traditionally Orthodox and remained so his entire life, but he's trying to himself struggle with all these ideas. I put together this thing, which I don't intend to speak to entirely. I gave it to you as a handout. We could do an entire course on modern Jewish history just based on this slide. But I just wanted to give you an idea that Judaism itself was in flux in these years. It isn't Kaplan who made it in flux. It is in flux. Hasidism is born around 1750. So that's only 130 years before Kaplan is born. In 1808, Napoleon emancipates the Jews, the Great Sanhedrin. The Prussians emancipate the Jews in 1812. In other words, they give them civil rights. This opens the door to assimilation. Suddenly you can be a Prussian citizen. A Jew can be a Prussian citizen. In 1820, the beginning of the movement called I can never pronounce it, the Wissenschaft des Judaism, the scientific study of Judaism, which starts out as an Orthodox movement of people who want to study Judaism using modern in 1820, historical methods, and do textual analysis and all those things that eventually lead to the EPD, whatever it is, theory of that the Torah is not all one author. That starts in the 1820s. The Musar movement, which his father belonged to, which is the anti-Hasidic reaction, sort of the Lithuanian reaction to Hasidism, but it emphasizes ethics. The most important thing about Judaism is ethics. All these things are happening in Judaism, pulling it in different directions, even before he's born. Beginning of mass Jewish immigration to America is essentially 1881. Kaplan is born in 1881. All this is happening. Nietzsche declares God is dead in 1887. All this is undermining of religion. All these things are going on. Things that are happening in the theories of religion and philosophy that are trying to modernize religion and philosophy and make them natural and make them, I guess William James is trying to make religion natural, which is an idea that Kaplan picks up. How do you base religion on modern science, on naturalism? He's a Christian, but he's trying to do that for Christianity. And Husserl is trying to say, how do you make philosophy based on inner human experience? What I feel counts and is significant philosophically. And these are ideas that Kaplan picks up on. At the bottom, we have sort of Kaplan's life. Again, he immigrates to the United States when he's 8 years old. He goes to the Jewish Theological Seminary and to Columbia University simultaneously. So what is the solution to the problem of Jewish survival in the diaspora? Well, it's Reconstructionism. And in a nutshell, these two quotes, the Reconstructionist movement is dedicated to the advancement of Judaism as a religious civilization. Again, it's not a religion, it's a religious civilization. The noun is civilization, religion is an adjective. To the upbuilding of Eretz Yisrael, he's a Zionist, although in a very peculiar way. We'll talk about that in 2 weeks more. And to the furtherance of universal freedom, justice, and peace. He ties Reconstructionism to being socially progressive and bettering the world. That's a cornerstone of what he believes. And, surprisingly for some people, the Jewish Reconstructionist foundation is responsive to the spiritual needs of the Jewish people. He understood what he was talking about to be spiritual. A lot of people, again, criticize him for not being spiritual, or being outwardly oriented. But he thought that outwardly oriented was spiritual, that was the essence of being spiritual. He also has two ideas, the big program and the small program. And the big program, which he writes about a lot, is to remake American Jewish life. He has ideas for how federations should be organized, how Jewish community centers should be organized, right? And how the entire structure of American Jewish life should be reorganized and rethought of. And he also has a small program, which is how to make a Jewish public religion meaningful for those Jews who seek a Jewish public religion. By public religion, he means what we do in synagogue, ritual. Right? Private religion is sort of your spiritual inner life, which he says, I can't talk about that too much, you know, that just is. Right? But he's talking about the public religion. And the Reconstructionist movement today is mostly about the small program. The big program has gotten lost, but I want us to talk a little bit about his idea for the big program. So the small program is for people who like to go to synagogue, how do we make, and are also modern, how do we make that comfortable for them? How do we make that meaningful? He didn't believe all Jews would want to go to synagogue, and he said that's okay too. Okay, but we tend to focus on the small program. He consistently does this. I call it beware false dichotomies. I wanted to have a t-shirt made up. I thought that would be a good t-shirt for beware of false dichotomies. When faced with opposing ideas, he always synthesizes them. He refuses to accept that they're opposed, and he tries to figure out some way to make them together. So, for example, is Judaism a religion or a nation? It's both. And he says it's a religious civilization of the Jewish nation, people. So is it, what is it? He combines them both. That's what Judaism is. Is Judaism particular or universal? And his answer is, like all civilizations, it is necessarily particular. You can't be a civilization unless you're particular, because you dissolve. You have to think about your own. British civilization is inward looking to a certain extent. It has to be, otherwise it is dissolved. But like all civilizations, it cannot only thrive by claiming and embracing the universal. It can only thrive if it claims and embraces the universal. So if you're totally particularistic, you become completely self-referential and nobody cares. So you have to be both. That's his answer to that question. Do we first fix ourselves, or do we first fix or save the world? And he says we must do both at the same time, and we can only succeed in doing one if we do the other. You can't fix the world if you yourself are troubled and broken, and you can't fix yourself without actively fixing the world, because that's what makes you a human being. How can you ignore the world and try to fix yourself? If you remember anything else from this entire course, just remember this slide. Okay? These are his four main ideas. Everything is expansion on these ideas. One, no supernaturalism. So he completely rejects the idea of supernatural God or supernatural anything. Okay? And he develops this idea of a transnational, which we'll talk about some more understanding of God, and he emphasizes human agency and responsibility. So essentially, God doesn't make miracles. There aren't any miracles. You can argue what God is or isn't, but one thing that he's adamant about is there aren't supernatural miracles. If there are miracles of anything, they're miracles that move us as people, and then we do whatever gets done. So the miracle is in us or through us. Second point, religion has value beyond literal truth. So even if we reject the literal truth of the Bible stories or the literal truth of the prayers, religion has value. Okay? Religion should be judged by its effects and not its dogma. Religion makes people behave better, and that's good enough for him. The dogmas are just ways to get there, right? Peoplehood. The Jews are first of all a nation with a common civilization. So we're not first of all a religion. The religion is just one of the aspects of the Jewish people's civilization. And but religion is an essential part of the Jewish civilization. So it's inconceivable to describe the Jewish civilization without religion in it, but it is much more than just religion. It's also dance, literature, food, language, history, everything that goes into a civilization. And lastly, ethical nationalism. He was a nationalist. He believed in the positive power of nationalism, a la Woodrow Wilson and all that good stuff that was bubbling up in the early part of the 20th century, right? But he understood that nationalism could be a force for both good and bad, and we must strive to make it a force for good. He thought it was a force for good, and it was inevitable anyways, but we need to make it a force for good. He also, He grew up in pre-World War I when nationalism was looked up to, but he also lived through the 30s when nationalism turned into a nightmare. So he understood both of these things, and he very strongly was into this idea of ethical nationalism. His last book, written in 1970, was called Ethical Nationalism, something, something. I can't remember the name of it, but that was his sort of last thing he wanted to tell people about. Kaplan believes in no supernaturalism. Kaplan believes in modern science, the concept of the laws of nature. Therefore, God did not and does not violate the laws of nature. Science proves that, as far as he's concerned. If God did not violate the laws of nature, therefore the biblical miracles did not occur as they are traditionally understood. If that's true, therefore revelation did not happen. There is no revelation at Mount Sinai, as traditionally understood. Therefore, religion is invented by human beings. Therefore, it is fallible and subject to change. Human beings are not perfect. Our ancestors were very smart. They got a lot of things right, but they got some things wrong, and we are allowed to reject it and change it. And it all follows A, B, C, D. He's just like, like a mathematical proof. That's how he tries to approach it. On the other hand, while this idea of no supernaturalism is essential for his whole system to make sense, he's not very dogmatic that all Jews need to accept it. He doesn't think that dogma is what is important. So he says, okay, this is what I believe, this is how my system makes sense. You don't want to accept it, I'm not going to get upset about it. On a community level, Kaplan believes in pluralism. He's absolutely convinced in pluralism. He understands that not everyone will believe everything, and he says we still have to act as a community anyways and interact with each other, because that's what counts, is the community interaction. Okay? And he understands that some Jews will never give up their belief in a supernatural God, and that's okay. He says it's not my taste and it doesn't make sense to me, but that's fine. So what does he believe God is? And we're going to go into this in much more detail next week, but just sort of some highlights. These are all quotes. God is the power that makes for salvation. Again, salvation, fulfillment, meaning. God is what allows us to find meaning and fulfillment in life and in the world. God is the power that makes for freedom, for justice, caring, and love. Without God, in other words, these things would be impossible as far as Kaplan is concerned. God is our helper. God is the underlying process in the universe that guarantees progress and the ability to fulfill our human potential. So this last one shows his great faith in progress. He believes history is a vector, as does traditional Judaism. At the end of it is the Messiah and perfection. And although he understands that there will be no personal Messiah, he does believe that we're going to get ever closer to perfection, and life is, if not perfectible, pretty damn close. We can get better and better and better, and we have been. And God is what guarantees that happening. I think a lot of us would doubt that today, but nevertheless, that's his belief. For Kaplan, God is not a personality, but a power or force that suffuses, underlies, is in every molecule of the universe. It's just there. It's sort of flowing through the universe like gravity. It's there. It's one of the forces that act on the universe is God. He does not believe in a chaotic universe, but he does not believe in a wholly materialistic or deterministic one. So he rails against materialism, which says the universe is chaotic. He believes in God is what makes the universe not chaotic. Certain things are guaranteed to happen. Progress is guaranteed to happen. Love is guaranteed to happen. Not in every individual case, but it will happen in general. Good things will happen, and that's because of God. The universe is not chaos and totally in the Darwinian, dog-eat-dog type of thing. He believes in what he calls a transnatural God, underlying force that pushes the world into a defined direction. For Kaplan, God is neither part of nature nor completely separate from nature. Okay, so God is in nature, but not identical to nature. And God is, yes, I think that's in nature, but not identical to nature. It's a force within nature. So he argues for a weak God, what's called theologically a weak God. God is not all-powerful. He's powerful. He influences things, but he's not all-powerful. He's just a force that pushes things in a direction, that sort of, over the long run, pushes things in a direction. Kaplan maintains that God is the creative process which transforms the chaos of the universe into an organic whole. And there's a quote again, nature in its infinite chaos, with all its evils, forever being vanquished by creativity, which which is God as infinite goodness. God is real, but is not an object, being, or a personality. That, again, is a quote of his. How can this be? Well, ask yourself, is love real? It's real. Most of us have experienced it, or if we haven't, we hope to. You know, is freedom real? It's real. Okay. Is justice real? Yes. Can you point to freedom? You can point to instances of freedom. You can say this society is free. You can't nail down freedom, but you can point to its manifestations in the world. Similarly with God, you can't put your hand on God, but you can put your hand on manifestations of God in the world. So he believes, right? Are these things, love, freedom, and justice, powerful? They're very powerful. People will kill, murder. Revolutions happen because of these things. They're very powerful. But they're not tangible. Are they immanent? We can point to Christ. Yes, they are. Are they transcendent? Do they move us? Are they abstract ideas that make us feel wonderful and stuff like that? Yes, they are. So God is love, freedom, justice, or the power that makes for love, freedom, justice. Da, 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 da. So his idea is you have to think about it, but to me it actually makes some sense. So for Kaplan, at some point he gives up on theology. You know, it's not that important. He describes it and he goes, but it's not that important, right? Okay? He believes that the idea of God is at least as important as God itself. I put itself on purpose to emphasize that God is not a person. Okay? So the idea of God is at least as important as God. How we understand God is as important as God itself. And Milton Steinberg, one of his students, railed against this. Kaplan's theology is not a theology at all, but the account of the psychological and ethical consequences of having one, which is, I think, a slightly unfair criticism. I think Kaplan also spoke about what he thought God was, but he also admitted that that's not important. What's important is how we think about God, not what God really is. Second idea, religion has value beyond its literal truth. So religion should be judged by its function and not its truth. We don't care if the story of liberation from Egypt is true or not. To him it says, who cares? That's a minor point. What's really interesting is how it has moved the Jewish people through the ages. What has it done? Well, it has made us value freedom. In the modern times, it has made us identify with other oppressed peoples. You know, it has given us hope for the future, that one day we would be liberated again. That's what's important about the Passover story, not whether it ever happened or not. He's not denying it happened. He says it's just not important. A religion is how people express and transmit its values. That is the function of religion, to express values and to transmit them to other people and the future generations. Any system of ethics that wishes to transmit itself into the future is a religion. So he's saying this is the nature of religion. And he talks about the American religion. He thought America had a civil religion, and I think it does. And it has a set of values, it transmits them, it has flag ceremonies, it has Thanksgiving, it has Independence Day. He talks America is creating an American religion. Religion is what gives meaning to people's lives, both at a collective level as a people and at the individual level. Religion meets the human need for transcendence. We all need to feel something greater than ourselves. This is a real need. This is not made up. This is not stupidity. This is psychology. The science of psychology tells us that we need this, and therefore we need religion, because this is what will do it for us. And religion meets the human need for hope. Again, this is a real need in his opinion. This is, you can prove it as far as he's concerned. People need hope. Without hope, they will, bad things will happen, and therefore religion provides that. And these are good things. Not, other people would say, oh, it just proves that religion is foolishness. He says, no, this is exactly why we need religion. Religious texts and rituals need to be analyzed as to their function and not to their meaning. And I think Mitch will be going into this a lot in his lecture at the end, but briefly, his ideas are that he has this term sancta, things that are holy, and these are text, objects, heroes, dates, rituals, and they are somewhat arbitrary. We could decide that this podium is holy, right? And if we believe it and talk about it and do that for a generation, it becomes holy. Everyone will treat it with holiness and revere it and be afraid to touch it and polish it and stuff like that. He admits that they're arbitrary, but he thinks they're important. We pour meaning into them. But once they have been sanctified, they really are holy. And they should not be changed or abandoned because they have emotional value for us. Religion must serve the people and not the other way around. One of his key ideas. Religion has to change to serve the people. People don't serve the religion. I mean, they do in some sense. They But the religion has to be functional for the people, and if it's not, it should be changed. And that's why he changes many things in Jewish ritual to make it more functional for people. Religion evolves by creating new sancta, new holy objects, for existing values. An example of that is Yom HaAtzmaut. So we always valued freedom and independence and the return to Israel. That was these are always eternal Jewish values. And we created a new holiday called Yom HaAtzmaut. That's an example of creating a new holiday, a new holy day, a new sancta for an old value. Or alternately, we assign new values to existing sancta. We take existing holy things and we give them new values which have now become necessary. And an example of that is Tu B'Shvat. So Tu B'Shvat originally was some minor date that had to do with taxation in the Talmud. When your taxes on your fruits were due, they were due on Tu B'Shvat. It was, that's when you had to pay your bikurim. And under the influence of modern Zionism, it became a holiday of trees. It became originally building up the land of Israel. That was a new value we wanted to promote, so we stuck it onto an old holiday. Right? And nowadays, people want to promote environmentalism, so we stick environmentalism onto Tu B'Shvat. He said that's all fine, that's good. That's exactly the way religion should work. We take values, we stick them onto old sancta, or we create new sancta and give them old values, and slowly it evolves and changes. So in 1,000 years, nothing is the same as it once was, but every step is incremental. The Jewish religion has always evolved. An example of that is sacrifice turned into prayer. It's an obvious one, we all know that. But Reconstructionism is the first movement to openly admit and embrace this fact. So he says Reconstructionism is different. Once you admit this, everything changes. You can't go back and pretend it doesn't change. So having once discovered this, we're stuck with this discovery. It somewhat demystifies everything, but that's life. You can't go backwards and pretend that it isn't there. Okay, religion must be relevant. He talks about two ideas here, transvaluation, which is pretending that the authors meant something other than what they really meant. So we read a story in the Bible and we pretend that it meant something else. And that's what traditional midrash is. You read a story in the Bible and say, the rabbis say, da 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 da, and everyone knows that that's not what the text says, right? But we suspend our disbelief and pretend that that's what the text says, right? There's some additional story behind this. So that's what he calls transvaluation. He says the Jews have always done that, nothing wrong with that. But he says he suspects this will not move people in the modern age because it's pretending, and we now understand it's pretending. We know it's not real. And once you know it's not real, it sort of loses its oomph, in his opinion. So he talks about revaluation, which is analyzing the function of a classical text or ritual and using it to achieve the same function in the modern context. In other words, Passover stands for freedom. It always stood for freedom, that's true. So we can therefore make the Haggadah and talk all about freedom and feel free to do that. We don't have to pretend that the ancients were talking about black civil rights. We know they weren't talking about black civil rights, but it always stood for freedom, and we can make the analogy of freedom from there to here and do that honestly. So he's trying to be honest in how he approaches things, as opposed to making up a midrash which said that Rabbi such and such freed his black slave, and that which would be a transvaluation sort of approach to make a midrash, as if it really happened once upon a time. So no, it didn't happen, but it's sort of functionally the same thing. So he also says, quite openly, rituals which have no relevant modern function, as a quote, should be assigned to archaeology. So we should analyze things for their function. What was their original function? If that function is no longer necessary, throw it out. It's just a burden. What was the function of Musaf? The function of Musaf was to remind us of the sacrifices in the temple. As long as Jews believed that the temple would one day be restored and hoped and prayed for that, Musaf made some sense. He says, we, meaning Reconstructionists, don't believe that's going to happen and don't want it to happen, right? We don't want to go back to sacrifices even if we could. So throw out Musaf. It's like no point, right? It doesn't have sort of any function as far as he's concerned. Is Judaism a religion or a nationality? Kaplan argues essentially that it is primarily a nationality because it's a nation that carries, develops, and transmits the religion. And again, the theology isn't important, and even rituals aren't that important. The Jewish nation, without its religious civilization, is not worth the effort, however. So if we just become a religion of Yiddish culture, which there were, of course, Yiddish culturalists in the 20s and 30s who thought that was it, he said, why bother? It's just a literature club. Is that worth all the sacrifice? It's nice literature, but is that worth, you know, huge amounts of self-sacrifice, donating thousands of dollars, money, you know, putting up with anti-Semitism? You know, no. His answer would be no. It's the ethics of the religion that make the whole thing worthwhile. The Jewish nation without its religious civilization cannot survive for long, again, because people won't see. It's the ethics and the fulfillment, the meaning, the ultimate purpose that gives people the oomph to keep it going. Again, if it's just the culture, Yiddish culture, it will fade out. And he was right. The Yiddish cultural clubs have faded out. They don't exist. They didn't survive. And synagogues have survived better than Yiddish culture clubs have survived. Kaplan is a theoretician of nationalism as much as he is of religion. So much of his books, many of his writings are about nationalism. Again, he grew up when Zionism was still a contested idea. He's writing about why Jews should be a Jewish nation. He thinks the Jews are a nation within the diaspora. How does the nation of the Jews live within the nation of America? How do these two nations coexist? This is something that he's very concerned with. And he expands these ideas. He realizes that what he's talking about is not just true for Jews. It's true for Italians, for Hispanics, for Catholics of various sorts in the United States who aren't truly American. They're not American Protestant wasps. How do they coexist in America? How do they keep their culture going in America? He said, and he goes back and forth in talking about Jews and talking about Catholics a lot in his writing. So again, nationhood is primarily about shared history, culture, and concerns. It's not about statehood or race. So you don't need a state to have a nation. He argues very strongly to separate the idea of state from nation. That allows Jews to exist in America. Okay, that's important for him ideologically and very important in his thinking. Okay, it's also not about race because Jews are obviously different ethnic groups. He recognized we are not literally descendants of anybody. People have converted over the years. Just look around the room and the different way people look. Eventually abandoned the term nation as too loaded with negative baggage, like nationalism gets a bad rap after the Second World War. And he changes, in 1957, he comes up with the word peoplehood. But he means nation. He means a soft idea. He means a soft idea of nation, what we might call in Canada a multicultural group. You know, the soft idea of nation without a state. That's what he means by peoplehood. Nation without a state is peoplehood for him. So individuals can only find fulfillment as part of a community and ultimately as a people. So he takes this simple idea, which you can't, you know, be an island to yourself, and he says you really need to be anchored in a people, something with a large culture, a large community, with its own issues and politics and community issues, and that's what makes you alive if you're involved in something like that. So you need to be anchored in a people. People serves as an intermediate and necessary bridge between the individual and the universal. It's just too hard psychologically to identify with humanity. You need sort of an intermediate step to identify with, so he believes. The people must serve the needs of its individual members. So if a people doesn't make its members happy, then the members won't want to be part of the people. So he said the Jewish community needs to have services that make the people happy. You need to have social services. You need to have cultural festivals. The people won't belong to it just out of loyalty. It has to be a mutual reciprocal relationship, right? The individuals support the people, and the people give something back to the individual. The people provides a transcendent link across space and time. It just makes us feel good. We feel, I identify with Jews around the world. I identify with Jews 1,000 years ago. I identify with Jews 1,000 years in the future. It's a way to achieve immortality. We invest our souls in the people. If the people lives onward, we live onward. I mean, these are emotions that speak to me, hopefully speak to some of you. And he says that's real and that's important. And the cultural rootedness in a people reinforces individual and equality and civil rights. Again, you identify first and foremost with people who are in your people, and then by extension you identify with the people beyond it. Okay, it's just too hard to identify with humanity in the abstract. Kaplan is concerned first and foremost with the health and welfare of the Jewish people, obviously, not just people in general, even though I have the theory of nationhood and peoplehood. The Jewish religion, culture, and social institutions must be revamped if Judaism is to survive and thrive in the modern era. And his entire program for the diaspora, he goes on at great boring lengths, and most of this is not so relevant today, about how it should be reorganized. Most of it's not relevant because half of it has happened of what he wanted to do. But he believes in strong community versus sectarian focus. So things like federations, Jewish community centers, cooperation across these denominational lines, which were much more rigid in his day than they are today. Community centers. He is often credited with inventing the idea of the community centers. He was brought to Canada in the 1920s as a consultant to the Canadian Jewish Congress to give them ideas on how to organize. And he thought this was the Canadian Jewish Congress was a wonderful idea because it was sort of going to be this political umbrella. It hasn't quite turned out that way, but this political umbrella for all of Canadian Jews where they could argue about things and create social policy, and it would be democratic. He believed that these community institutions must be democratic, which sadly they aren't today. They were more democratic maybe 20, 30 years ago than they are today. He believed in pluralism, that all Jews should belong to these Jewish community organizations. No matter what their individual beliefs, they should all come together, fund things together. He believed that the community had to invest heavily in education and culture. And again, today in Toronto, many of these things have happened. Our community does invest heavily in education and culture, but these weren't always obvious things. And Toronto is still somewhat an exception in North America. Zionism. So he was a Zionist. He believed that upbuilding of Eretz Yisrael and the whole idea of Zionism would reinvigorate the Jewish people. But he was very much a cultural Zionist in the mold of Echad Ha'am, who was an opponent of Herzl, who thought that the state was the state will come someday in the distant future. It's not important. What's important is about building a thriving culture in Eretz Yisrael. And the politics, if we're under the Turks, we're under the British, who cares? That was the Echad and he followed in that mode. He was very wary of chauvinism. He writes already in the 20s and 30s that he thinks the Zionist movement is too chauvinistic. They don't treat the Arabs nicely. It's leading to bad ideas within Judaism. They're becoming proud for no good reason. He's very wary of that. And he's also very wary, especially later on, and very opposed to Ben-Gurion's idea of negation of the diaspora. So again, this is not such a popular idea today, but in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, Ben-Gurion and a lot of Zionists believe the only good Jew is the Jew who makes Aliyah to Israel. Judaism in the diaspora is doomed. Come to Israel, it's the only place that will survive. And he was very much opposed to that. He thought there would be a center in Israel and a center in the diaspora, and they would mutually support each other. He believed that in both Israel and the diaspora, Jewish life must be made relevant to the individual Jew. So even in Israel, you still have to work at making Jewish life relevant. It's not enough just to live in Israel. It has to offer a promise of individual betterment. Somehow Judaism has to improve your life, or why bother? And it has to make the person proud of being part of the Jewish people. You want to shep nachas from the Jewish people. And again, a quote, Jewish life will only survive not as a result of the Jews' adaptation to the status quo, but as a result of identification with those movements which are intended to increase freedom, justice, and peace in the world. He wanted Jews to be at the progressive leading end of all these social movements that were happening throughout the 20th century. Final big idea, ethical nationalism. So again, he was a nationalist, but he saw the problems in nationalism. So nations are necessary and inevitable, and they can be a force for either good or bad. We must make them a force for good. In a sense, Kaplan, I believe, I don't know if he invented it, but he invented multiculturalism. You read his ideas of nations and its multiculturalism. He could have been teaching multiculturalism in the university today, some of his ideas. In an ideal world, all states would be multicultural, multinational, and all nations would be multi-state. So the first half of that sentence, all states would be multinational. Everybody would be like America, where there are many nations in America. There are Hispanics, there are Jews, there are Italians, there are whatever. There's also an American nation, but overlaid on that are these other national groups or peoples. He thought that was a good thing and an ideal thing and a thing to be worked toward, as opposed to Europe, where Poland is for the Poles and Romania is for the Romanians, and therefore they always have a problem of defining who's a Romanian, who's not a Romanian, who's a Pole, who's not a Pole. But when a state becomes multinational by definition, you don't have that problem. Who cares? We're all Americans, but we're also all something else, right? The other half of the sentence, all nations would be multi-state, is that just like the Jews live in many states, all nations will live in multi-states. He talks about immigrants coming from India and those kind of places. He's very prescient. He says someday everyone will be like this. As immigration increases around the world and people move from one place to another, all nations will be multi-state. So Hindus will be multi-state. They will live all over the world and have some affinity to the Hindu nation or the Indian nation. But they'll also be part of Canada, the US, England, wherever else they live. They'll also have these two identities. And therefore, peoples and nations would work across state lines for equality and peace. He believed that once this happened, how could nations go to war? The Jews somewhat naively, the Jews in England won't want to go to war with the Jews in France, or, you know, because of these multinational conflict things, people will feel an affinity to their people around the world and will be less likely to be chauvinistic for their state, right? And they'll feel less likely to go to war. I don't know if that's naive or not. Maybe that's somewhat true, maybe not. The greatest threat to the world is from chauvinism, intolerant nationalism, and war. Well, if you grew up in the 30s and lived through the Second World War and the Cold War, you would have no doubt that was true. I think that's also still true today. The Jewish people have a special role in promoting ethical nationalism. A unique history and the unusual combination of difficulties have conspired to place upon the Jewish people the task of demonstrating the spiritual potentialities of nationhood. Because of our history of being oppressed, we have the opportunity to create the perfect nation. Again, I don't know what he would think about Israel today, but that's what his hope was, that not both Israel and the greater Jewish nation that lives in Israel and the diaspora would create this sort of perfect new nation, type of nation. The Jewish people's mission is to teach universal brotherhood. It can be taken, this mission, which is to teach universal brotherhood, can be taken seriously only when it is translated into a definitive program. And the program consists of the abolition of chauvinistic nationalism, the outlawing of war, and the establishment of economic justice. So again, we see the mood, you know, economic justice, peace, these are things that Jews must hold up strongly. Without religion to curb and direct modern nationalism, humanity will be re-barbarized. So again, he thinks what's wrong with the Nazis, or fascists in general, is they are nationalists without religious values. Right? They're just about the nation. The people becomes everything in a fascist society. Right? My nation over everything. Loyalty to the people is everything. He says, yes, that's important, but without religion and ethics, you become fascist. So summing up Kaplan's Reconstructionism, Judaism is the evolving religious civilization of the Jewish people, his famous one-line quote. Judaism must constantly adapt, that's the evolution part, to serve the spiritual and material needs of the Jewish people. So it has to adapt to serve the needs, both spiritual and material. Judaism must bring out the best and the fullest in human potential. Again, that's its goal. If it's not about improving human potential and making us the best we can possibly be, it's not worth it. It must ally itself with those movements that offer ethical progress and human betterment. So by that he meant both political movements and intellectual movements and science. You know, we should study psychology. We should be modern and, you know, learn from psychology, from sociology, from political science, and integrate all those things into our Jewish life. Judaism must teach the Jew to understand and to trust in God, the force for individual and collective salvation. So he's not an atheist. He sounds sometimes like he's an atheist, but he's not. He believes in God, and you must trust in God. What he means in this is you have to have this underlying faith, I think, that what he's saying, you have to have an underlying faith that things will turn out. So when you do something that sounds crazy or not practical, but is good, he says, do it. Have faith that God will be with you, that God will make it work out. Maybe not this individual time, but in the long run, these ideas will work out. And this idea of God is what gives you hope to go forward. It's this underlying force in the world that tells us to do things and will, in a sense, over the long run, guarantee that they will work out. Judaism must be in harmony with both the physical and human sciences. So we can't go against modern knowledge. Modern knowledge is correct. And so we must be in harmony with it and adjust ourselves. If we have ideas that are out of sync with some new discovery, we need to adjust our ideas and not reject it. And finally, I wanted to end up with this was the 13 Wants. He put this up in the SAJ, the Society for Advancement in Judaism, sometime in the 20s. This was apparently tacked up on the wall, and everybody who joined the SAJ, at least at some point, had to sign that they agreed. Okay, he was a tough guy. So what does he think? This is like the 10 Commandments. This is his reworking of the 10 Commandments, the 13 wants. My daughter said wants, that's a funny word. What he meant by wants is desires. These are things that we desire, need, want to work for. And I'm just going to read them because they sound a little funny, but they're still quite relevant. We want Judaism to help us overcome temptation, doubt, and discouragement. Again, hope, positiveness, we want Judaism to move us in that direction. We want Judaism to imbue us with a sense of responsibility for the righteous use of the blessings with which God has endowed us. We want the Jew to be so trusted that his yea will be taken as a yea and his nay as a nay. We want to learn to utilize our leisure to the best advantage, physically, intellectually, and spiritually. Again, leisure was a new concept in 1920. People suddenly had leisure time, so he was concerned about this, so we should be able to use this well. We want the Jewish home to live up to its traditional standards of virtue and piety. Okay, so he was also very family-oriented at home. He emphasized what I would say traditional Jewish values of family, where he's not revolutionary in that sense at all. We want the Jewish upbringing of our children to further their moral and spiritual growth and to enable them to accept with joy their heritage as Jews. We want the synagogue to enable us to worship God in sincerity and truth. So no bullshit. We need to be able to believe what we're saying. We want our religious traditions to be interpreted in terms of understandable experience and to be made relevant to our present-day needs. So we need to figure out, what does this mean to us today for everything that we study or do. We want to participate and not be nostalgic, because much of Judaism is about nostalgia, and he didn't like that. We want to participate in the upbuilding of Eretz Yisrael as a means to the renaissance of the Jewish spirit. So this is his cultural Zionism. Eretz Yisrael, but not for national pride, which is one line of Zionism, not for physical protection of Jews, which is another strand of Zionism, although he wouldn't have been against those things, but because it will be a renaissance of the Jewish spirit. We will be able to create new Jewish literature, new Jewish dance and music. This is what will come out of Eretz Yisrael, and that's what we need. We want Judaism to find rich, manifold, and ever new expressions in philosophy, letters, and the arts. We want all forms of Jewish organizations to make for spiritual purpose and ethical endeavor. We want the unity of Israel throughout the world to be fostered through mutual help in times of need and through cooperation in the furtherance of Judaism at all times. And we want Judaism to function as a potential influence, we want Judaism to function as a potent influence for justice, freedom, peace in the life of men and nations. Universalism, tying it to universal progress. That's his vision in the 1920s, and everything else that he wrote, 11 books and hundreds of articles, is an expansion on that.